Stephen Reynolds with us today to talk a little bit about education and innovation in the classroom. He has spent a lot of his career working on structural geology. He's authored many maps and textbooks, some of us which we have used and are currently using. Some of you probably have used some of his stuff, maybe even know it, like probably have as well. So hopefully he can give us, some of our TAs, some pointers, and some of us teaching large classes, some ideas about better reaching our students, especially in this new time of new technologies. So I'll turn it over to you, and we'll see what you have to say.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks for letting me show up here on fairly short notice. And okay, there you go. Yeah, on fairly short notice, and it is true that I'm a structural geologist. But at some point, I got really frustrated with how little our students were learning. And then at some point later, after figuring out some things we could do in class to engage students, I realized that textbooks were a problem. And so one of the reasons I wrote some textbooks is because I was just frustrated with how little students were learning. So I'm not really going to talk about the textbook stuff today, but I'm going to talk about some of the research that got us into understanding what students are doing when they're interacting with various kinds of materials. And it's not often that you come to a talk where somebody's going to show you a type of data that you've never seen before, but I think I'll show you a kind of data that you've never seen before. And so we'll go from there. So one of the things, if you think about, geology is really visual science, and the question is, what happens when students in our classrooms see the things we show them, whether they're maps or photographs or figures, and frankly, we don't really have a clue what kinds of things the student actually sees compared to what we show them. And so once we started looking into worrying about this question, we got very interested in how we think and what cognitive scientists think about how we think about pictures versus words. And so I'm going to talk about some of those things and talk about some examples of 3D visualization and some things you can do. As we go along, this is really informal. As we go along, I'm going to have you experience things, and then I'm going to explain to you why I did it that way. And so if you're a TA, you'll say, oh, okay, that's why you might want to do something that way. So there'll be a little bit of kind of cognitive geoscience education research, some teaching tips, all kind of blended together. Okay, so I'm going to show you a photograph, and I want you to pay attention to where you look. Just look at it like you would normally. Of course, I've already ruined that, but but not only do that, but pay attention to where your brain takes that photograph. Okay, so pay attention to where you look and what you think about this photograph. So Riley, what's one thing that you thought about when you saw this? Or what's one thing you looked at?
The abrupt change there across the middle.
Okay. John?
His yellow jacket.
His yellow jacket. Students notice the red laces. Exactly. You see the red laces. And so the thing that's interesting, of course, so this actually is a very famous geologist. If you've ever read anything on the Grand Canyon, there's a geologist named Ivo Lukita that talked about the erosion, the upward headland erosion model for formation of the Grand Canyon. That's Ivo Lukita. It was a rainy day, so he has a raincoat on. It's Arizona, so there's not much soil and stuff. And there's a reverse fault here that's putting a bunch of crystalline rocks on top of a bunch of Miocene sandstones. And so what we want to show students is this reverse fault. What students mostly see is they see Ivo Lukita. And so these are the various things you could have seen. You know, if you're very sophisticated, you might have noticed that these rocks are kind of doing a little bit of that. John's nodding his head. People who do a lot of field work might have seen that stuff. And an upside down one. And so the other thing that we do, it turns out, and we don't tell our students much, is we do something that the cognitive folks call disembedding. We take a scene like this that has, there's 30 or 40 joints in it. There's 500 pieces of loose rock laying on the surface. And what we do, we extract it into that. And we say, I don't have to pay attention to everything in there. I just have to note that there was a pile of loose rocks. There's a cliff that's got fractures in it. And so we take what's a complex scene and we disembed it into a few key elements. And we do this all the time. It's why some of us take students to outcrops and we say, look at this recumbent fold. And they say, what are these circular things, these channels cut down through the outcrop? Those are the drilling where they made the outcrop, or those are the bulldozer blades, or whatever it is. It's not what we want you to look at. And so disembedding is really something about being able to see the signal in a complex pattern. There are actually cognitive tests that the test for this is called field dependence independence. And they can give people this test, and they can typically tell if somebody is going to be a general practitioner nurse or somebody who's going to be a nurse for a surgeon. There's things like this. And it turns out this is a really important skill. We typically don't teach it. I explicitly teach disembedding in my classrooms over and over again, saying, when you look at this, you just say there's cliffs, like there's this kind of slope that's got these ledges and things. So, you don't have to pay attention to every one of those. It's just you treat that whole thing as one object. And so we do this all the time, and we don't tell the students we do it. So that's disembedding, I think, is one really unappreciated thing. I've written some things in it about it in some of the publications. So look at this one and see what you see. Anybody here do seismic stuff? No? Seismic exploration? Looks like some kind of a weird seismic profile. It's one of those sand boxes that you flip upside down and it'll make sands. But when you look at this, at least me, that's one unit. This is another unit. That's another unit. There's like 2 or 3 things, and your brain extracts those things. And in this particular case, you say, that's a system of that's prograding off to the right with time. I mean, that looks like a delta or something like that. And so I don't pay a lot of attention to the internal details. I just notice this is going like this. This is a place where the sand came straight down and piled up there. And then at some point, the locus of deposition kind of migrated along here and made this thing that, for all the world, looks like a delta. Kind of is a delta, I guess. So it turns out there's all kinds of strategies you can use to try to help students disembed problems. For example, if we were to look at that geologic map of the U.S., it's a very complicated thing. And if you wanted to kind of get that into your brain, you'd have to focus on one part at a time. And so one example of how you could do this is something where we're talking about different kind of soils, and you want to talk about the distribution of soils. You could have a big world map, and the students could maybe look at it from different places, but this lets you say, I'm only going to look at the northern hemisphere, or the Americas. I'm only going to look at Asia and Africa. I'm only going to look at Eastern Asia. And so you can kind of isolate things one at a time. So sometimes it helps to just isolate it to a single element rather than show you a map of all the soils in the world. I say let's pick out one soil, and then let's try to split out isolate each little part of it together. So for example, these are from the PowerPoints of my textbook. Yeah, you can run that. Oh, I don't know why it's got that big. No, thank you. So look at these are sea surface temperatures. I'd like you to look at the patterns that are expressed here and talk to the person next to you about what you see as the main patterns. The warmer colors like red are hotter temperatures, and the purple is the coldest. So do that. Just I could grab it and drag it, but it's going to get there fast enough, so. Okay, so now with the person next to you, I want you to observe the patterns in the Atlantic and tell me why they didn't look like the patterns in the Western Pacific. Look at in the Western Pacific, the pattern, if we'd gone around and talked about, they're nice and symmetrical, high temperatures right along the equator. That's not what's going on here. So talk to each other about what you think are some possibilities. What's the pattern that you see, and then what are some ways you could explain it? Okay, so Riley's partner, what did you come up, what's an observation you came up with? Sorry, I only know her name.
I said it looked like it may be a little warmer where it's presumably a little shallower.
Okay, so it could be warmer where it's shallower. How about you guys? Tony, I know his name too.
Colder, closer to the land masses.
It's colder, closer to the land masses. John, I know your name.
It looks like the Caribbean is warmer, maybe due to currents bringing warm water up.
Okay, Dr. King?
It's warmer north of the equator, looks like. I think that's where the hurricanes are. It's something.
Okay, so let me tell you what I just did. There are two kinds of questions. Am I going to be bad about the video here? There are two kinds of questions that you can ask in a class. One is, Riley, what's the age of the Pennsylvania-Mississippian boundary? Don't answer that. Okay? That's called a convergent question. There's one right answer, except we're talking about the time scale, so maybe there's more than one. But yeah, one right answer. The instructor knows the right answer. The student knows that the instructor knows the right answer. And there's kind of infinite numbers of wrong answers. You know, it could be 231. It could be 405. Who knows? And so it turns out that's a really risky thing to do in a class. I one time attended a class where they said, what's your good teaching tips? And somebody said, use the Socratic method. About 10 seconds later, I said, to not use the Socratic method. Because the Socratic method usually uses those convergent questions. They're converging on a single answer. The kind of question I asked is, what kind of patterns do you observe? That's called a divergent question. People are making their own observations. It's not like there's one right answer, one wrong answer. And if you want to get discussion going, you ask divergent questions, and you give students a chance to talk with each other. And then, like you were ready to volunteer an answer because you guys had a conversation and you felt more comfortable about what the patterns were. And so that combination of a divergent question plus the students having a chance to talk about it is really something that helps classroom discussion. Another colleague and I were teaching physical geology classes, big classes, 250 students, back to back. And on one day, I'd ask only convergent questions, and he would ask only divergent questions. And we were sitting in each other's classes, and we could see it was like a total difference. The only problem, so if whoever was using the divergent questions, the classroom was alive, and there was all this discussion, and students were identifying patterns. And if you were trying to shut it up with a convergent question, not only did it shut up the class for that day, it took a couple days to get over it. And go ahead, yeah.
This may be kind of off the mark, but your first question, which was a convergent question about what is the age of the Mississippi Pennsylvania boundary. I'm trying to figure out how one would ask a divergent question if you really wanted the students to know whether it's a good idea that you want the students to know that it's 200 and some million years or not.
Yeah.
How would you ask a divergent question to get at the same point in that exam?
That would be hard to do. I do ask convergent questions in class, but I have warned the students about the difference between divergent and convergent questions. And I say, if I ask you a convergent question, I don't want you to try to answer it. I want you to talk to the person next to you about what you think it is. So that would be a case I would maybe get them to talk about what they think it is, and then I would tell them what the answer was. But I would not want to have the students volunteering the answers, because if he says it's 235 and I say, well, that's way off. How about you? You think she wants to answer after that one? I don't think so. You know. So anyway, so I use convergent questions. Like, sometimes you want to know there's this lava flow, and it's got a baked contact below it, and there's not a baked contact above it. What does that tell you about the age of this unit compared to the rocks above and below it? That's kind of there's one answer, or what do you think the sequence of events is? What's the oldest rock in this image? And so there is one answer, but so I want the students to talk about it, but then I'll typically say it. Sometimes I'll have students volunteer it, but I prefer not to do it, because once you get some wrong answers, it tends to shut up the rest of the conversation. So, yeah, I do it all the time. So anyway, so the other thing I wanted to point out is I could have just lectured you about what the distribution of sea surface temperatures is, and hopefully you can see that these temperatures, the high temperatures are shifted north of the equator, and that's largely because there's this big cold current coming up the side of Africa here, and then this is kind of reflecting the Gulf Stream and things like that. So basically, the patterns in here are telling you something about ocean currents. Now, once I show you this and you've looked at the patterns, if then I explain what the patterns are and that they're ocean currents are, that's more likely to stick in your brain. And so what we try to do a lot in class is what I've just done, which is called a learning cycle. The student gets a chance to observe first, and then you explain the terms, introduce terms, explain content, and then you get the students to apply it someplace else. Because then you could say, so we've just explained that pattern along Africa is due to that. Okay, let's explain the pattern off the west coast of South America. And you can say, oh, I bet that's an ocean, a cold current coming up, the Humboldt current coming up here and displacing the water. And so that's the third phase, an application. So the students get a chance to observe and explore, and then you do explain the concepts and the terms, and then the students get a chance to apply it. If there's really good scientific education literature on that if you do that in class, the students learn more than if you just done this, which is still useful, but if that follows the students exploring it first, it's way better. Then the student says, yeah, I saw that pattern, and then it has a chance of going into long-term memory. So, and in the PowerPoints I've done for these books I've done, this is what they look like. Not a single bullet list in them. They're figures associated with things because it looks easier to use. You can see exactly what we're talking about with these things. So here's the new kind of data I'm going to show you. So my students and I have an eye tracking lab. And so what an eye tracking lab is, it's a computer monitor, and we can display whatever we want to on it. And it's got this little box, and it shines infrared light off your eyes, and it tells where you're looking at a microsecond by microsecond sense. And so we're looking at how students interact with materials of various sorts. So here's an example. One of my PhD students, now working for Chevron, at least last week he was working for Chevron. I hope he's still working for Chevron. And so he's, we took this image. This is the little Colorado River Gorge, east of the Grand Canyon. If you know this place, you know that there's no possible way that there are climbers on that cliff. You can't get there. The Native Americans that control this would kill you instantly if you violated this spot. So we photoshopped in 2 climbers. And so we gave one group of people, they looked at this image without the people in it, and the other group saw the image with the people in it, and we compared the differences between the 2. And so here's a case where, I don't know if the dog was probably there and photoshopped out there. These people were not here. That's my original picture. These people were photoshopped in. And so we gave, the students saw these images. 8 of the ones that they saw had what we call distractors, people, dogs, other things, water balloons, who knows what. And half of the people saw this. And everybody saw eight with the distractors and 8 with. So every student, we were able to kind of look at what they were doing. And so then what we do, we take these what are called area of interest boxes, and we say, well, the students are this is a 3-minute little video. We're talking about joints and fractures. And so presumably the students are going to be looking at joints and fractures. So we say, well, maybe they'll look at this one, they'll look at this one, they'll look at this one. The students that got the climber, we're going to want to make sure that there's a little place so we can tell if they're looking at the climbers. And then students look at horizons. We also coded for whether students were looking at the progress bar, like how long is this going to go on? And so we did that as well. And then each little red dot tells you where the student's gaze went, and the little purple lines are connecting them. The size of the dot tells you how long they stayed. And so you can tell this student looked at the climbers, checked the progress bar once early on, checked the progress bar later, basically didn't look at any of the joints. And so we can then take that data and contour it and turn it into what we call focus maps. Some people call them heat maps. And so you can see this particular student, they're basically burning a hole in here. And you notice they looked up here. If there are people in the scene, you either look at the person, you look at where the person is going, or you look at potential danger to the person. So if there's a bush and you're worried about Tyrannosaurus rex coming around from behind the bush, then the student will look at the bush. In this case, we think they were worried about where the climber was going to go next. So we can take that for a whole bunch of students. We eye-tracked hundreds of students to try to get this information. And so the first takeaway is the students look right at the center of the image. So here's here's Sicker Point, here's this thing, the fault scarp. But in all cases, the students pretty much look, you think they might follow this. They follow it a bit, but they don't. They kind of burn a hole. If there's nothing too distinctive, they just burn a hole right in the center of the image. So as an instructor or TA, if you're trying to illustrate something to your students, it's best to have it in the center of the image because they're most likely to look at it there. Sometimes for aesthetic reasons or other reasons, the thing of interest is off to the side. Maybe they'll see it, maybe they won't. And then we compared the data for those number of students that saw the distractor versus those that didn't. If the climbers were in here, the students paid a lot of attention to the single fracture where the climbers were. If there were no climbers, then the students tended to explore more of the image. So what it's telling us, and in this case here's Evo, here's the dot for his red shoes, red laces, down there, or one of those. And but if Evo's not in there, if Evo's here, they go from the back of the image, the center of the image, to his head. If you can see the head, you see the head. If the person's turned away, the tendency is to look at the rear end. Okay, I'm not making any judgments there, but that's just what the data is. And but see, in this case, the students actually started to go up and down that reverse fault bit. And so, for that reason, everything I've ever written has what I call a photo Sharpie in it. It's a Sharpie, but I've scratched off the words Sharpie on it. The reason? With the eye tracker, we can see the students turn their head and read the word Sharpie on the pen. So I want to scale, but I want it to be so uninteresting that the student looks at the rock or the fault scarp. And this is the case. I didn't feel like I needed a scale. I could have said, well, go stand out there so I've got a scale. But the students would have been paying attention to what's that person wearing? Do they have red shoelaces or not? And so if you've ever seen our books and you wonder why there's hundreds of photos of this Sharpie, is because we want the students to see that there's a scale, but we don't want them to get distracted by it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cognition. So the cognitive people think that we have these two processing systems in our brains. This isn't the left brain, right brain. This is just two processing systems in our brain, one for pictures and one for words. Each one of those has a limited amount of working memory. And it actually takes a lot of effort to reconcile information between those subsystems. And so if you're reading a traditional textbook and you have a long column of text, all that stuff's going into the text processing system, and then you see a picture, you're now having to say, well, where does that refer to in that picture? And maybe that picture's on the next page or something like that, so you're flipping back and forth and things like that. Turns out cognitively, that's very difficult to do. The best example of this is I ran a workshop and a guy says, I used to be a picture framer. And I worked in a place that had a bunch of jerks as co-authors. And so what you would do, you'd say, okay, I need to frame this picture, and you'd memorize the two measurements. It's 47 by 36. But as you were going from measuring the picture to where you had to get the materials to get the frame, your workmates would be shouting random numbers at you. 34, 33 and a half, and the guy said, I couldn't keep those two numbers in my brain unless I memorized one of them as a number, and the other one I had to memorize. When you were a kid, you had those birthday had big numbers, they're big thick numbers on the top of the birthday cake. He had to visualize one of the set of numbers as those, and then the other one as an actual number, as a normal number in his brain, and he could carry those two numbers across. Anyway, an anecdote. It was interesting. So there's a guy named Richard Mayer, very interesting guy out of Santa Barbara, and he did a whole bunch of experiments, and it was really exploring this idea of these two processing systems. And so in one example, they would give students a bunch of paragraphs describing how lightning forms, and then you'd have some figures that go along with it without many labels in the figures. And one group of students got that, and then another group of students got this, where it's the exact same text, but it was now broken up, and you started having labels and things like that, but it's the exact same text. And so they gave two group of students that, and they did this experiment again and again and again, and they said they gave them a pre-test and a post-test, and they figured out how much they could learn, how much they could remember from it. And what they found is if the text and the illustrations are separate things, students could recall less. And this is something that's called a transfer test. Transfer test is, can you troubleshoot the system? Can you change variables? Could you say, if you're operating lightning, how could you get more lightning? Well, I want to have more hail, or whatever you need to make more lightning. Do they understand the processes enough to be able to extrapolate and to change the variables? And what they found is not only I didn't show you the data on recall, but the people who got the integrated text and figures, they actually were able to use that information more deeply than the people who got the separated text and figures. And then the one that really got us when we were doing this research is they gave one group of students this, integrated text and figures, and they gave another group of students this, plus this little paragraph that describes it. The students who only got this learned more than the students who got both of those. And there's evidently something that Richard Mayer called the redundancy effect, is that the student is now having to reconcile this text with this text, and it turns out you just learn less if you have to do that. And so we said, well, if you were going to develop educational material, it would look like that, and it wouldn't have this other stuff next to it. And so this is an example of that kind of material. This is an example of the atmospheric circulation. It's called a Walker cell, for those who know. That's basically related to what happens in an El Nino. And this is when you don't have an El Nino. This is the normal setup. And so you can see in this case, you have really warm water out here in the Western Pacific. You saw that on the sea surface temperature map. And that causes moist air to rise, and that has to go somewhere, and so it kind of flows out this way. And so you can follow this airflow around and see exactly how the system operates. Imagine trying to understand that if I took that exact same data and I put it in a bunch of paragraphs, and it was referencing the figure with letters or something like that. It would be way harder to understand. And so from the standpoint of whatever kind of educational materials you want to develop, we would recommend it look like this. You say something, and they can say, oh, that's exactly where they're talking about. Like in this case, if we want to say, well, if you wanted to get more, more of this, what would you do? Where would the warm water be? Where would it not be? The other thing that I think falls out of Richard Mayer's research is that the more concrete examples you can give to students, the better. And so this is a case where you're talking about rivers, and so we give them satellite views versus conceptualized diagrams versus 3D diagrams versus evolutionary diagrams versus an actual photograph. And so the more kind of representations of the system you can come up with, the better it's going to be for student learning. Likewise, if you can integrate different aspects. So this is a case where you say, here's the characteristics of a volcanic dome. Here's how they are formed, and there are a couple ways they're destroyed, and here's how they're destroyed, and here are the rocks in them, and here's the hazards associated with them. So in 2 pages, the student gets a good understanding of what a volcanic dome looks like, the kind of rock types, the kind of hazards, and it's all kind of integrated together in one thing. So we said, well, we have an eye tracker. Let's look at how students look at these different kinds of materials. So this is a case, we would never look at the data this way, but so each one of these numbers in the blue spots tells you the student's eye went there, it went there, it went there, it went there. And so the eye tracker is keeping track of everything the student's doing where they're looking. And so we set up what we thought was a good test of these different options. A traditional textbook has got the text like this, and then they throw the figure somewhere. You know, like the textbook author writes something, he says, I need a picture of a giraffe, or I need a picture of a volcano, or something, you know, whatever they need. And it just gets put somewhere. And we said, well, but based on the eye tracking data that we'd seen so far, if we put the figure in the middle, the student's more likely to look at it. So just putting it in the middle of the page should help. And then we said, yeah, but the best ought to be this, where you're pointing. Here they still have to read through this, and there's letters here, and they have to go back and forth. Here you're pointing to it, and you're saying, here's where you go see things. And so this is a case where the figure's in the middle. And so what we did, we gave these students a pre-test. It was a 7-item question, and then we gave them a post-test, and we see how many they learned. And the difference between those two is their gain score. So this is a case where a student, after reading all that stuff, spending about 3 or 4 minutes, they learned like they got one more right. So they didn't learn much. And notice this student's reading here. There are little orange dots. There's a few little things here. And then here, no dots there. Then here, still no dots here. Oh, look at this darn figure. It's in the way. I'll look at it. And then they move on. They move on, and they look at it a couple more times right at the end.
That's the same student.
That's the same student. The same student. That's the progression that the student did that in. And the students spent about 5% of their time looking at the figure. And so here's a case where the students started with a little less knowledge about it. They only got 1 right out of 7 on the pre-test. They got all of them right on the post-test. And here's a student that went down and read and looked at the figure. Went down and looked at the figure. Notice this isn't with the leaders. This is just with, letters and numbers and stuff in there, and the figure right in the middle. And so this is somebody that we'd say is somebody that's a figure inspector. They inspect the figure as they go along, and that student is more likely to learn stuff. So here's another figure inspector with the leaders. So you would think this is the optimum thing. They should be looking to the specific right part of the figure, things like that. And likewise, the student does very well on it. And so I've just got one more. So we have this beautiful page, how it's designed. And here's a student that reads this and reads this. There are leaders going over here, and they're barely following leaders. Once in a while they just dart into the middle of random place in the figure. All these leaders here, they never bother looking at the figure. They never bother looking at the figure. And lo and behold, look how they do. Poorly. And so what we found with this experiment was that the chief predictor of how well a student did on the post-test was how many times they went from the figure to the text. Students who were more likely to do that learned more than students who didn't. And so we did a variety of things. We could put each paragraph in an area of interest and the figure in a different area of interest, and then we can kind of just plot it. And so, for example, here's this student. This student looked at the figure at the start, read paragraph 1, paragraph 2, all these paragraphs, looked at the figure once, looked at it again, and I can tell you that that student would not have done very well on the post-test. Whereas here's a student that as they went along, they've checked out the figure, checked out the figure, checked out the figure, and so what we found out, the more times a student goes back and forth in the figure, the better they do. This is something now in classrooms we tell the students, you will learn more if you go back and forth from the text to the figures. No matter what book you're using, no matter what kind of material, if you take the time to go look at the figure and then go back and continue reading, you will learn more than if you don't. And you'll get better grades. Sometimes that last part's the most important. And so we did a variety of plots. I don't want to dwell on these. But you know, the students that either had the figure right in the middle with lots of letters on it, they looked at the figure quite a bit. If the figure was kind of tacked on, students spent less time doing it. If the figure was in the middle, they tended to look at it more, no matter which kind of layout it was with the figure in the middle. And this was the thing, this was the gain score. And so the students who had the traditional textbook on average gained a couple extra questions, 2 to 3. And the students who had the leaders and stuff, those students learned four more items. And so we think, along with Richard Mayer's data, it's really unequivocal data that if you have integrated text and figures in whatever kind of educational material you use, students will learn more. So putting together web pages, putting together lab manuals, anything like that, if you can have it integrated text and figures. Now luckily, a structural geologist, this is how we think. You know, we think there's this outcrop, and I'm going to sketch the outcrop, and then you label it. That's kind of integrated text and figures. So, you know, maybe this was really well suited to the kind of person I am. The other thing we found out is that students don't always look at the figure when you reference it. We say, go look at the figure here. Doesn't help. They commonly looked at the figure if they were at a section break, you know, someplace where they could find their way back to, or if the figure was in the way. So one of the things that we think comes out of this supports something that Julia Johnson and I have been talking about for quite a while, is this idea of a concept sketch. A concept sketch is a simple sketch annotated with complete sentences that explain the features, the processes, and the interrelationships between things. And so, for example, this is a concept sketch of what some of the processes are going on in a mid-ocean ridge. And you can tell it's an integrated text and figure. So if a student can take material and generate this on their own in integrated text and figure, they're likely to learn even more than if they just read materials that have this kind of stuff. And here's an example that was done in an in-class exam where we said, draw us a concept sketch showing us the locations of earthquakes, the settings of earthquakes in an ocean-continent convergent boundary. And it's a good one, but we've done this with 20,000 students in our online class, with 10,000 students in our in-person class. I could show you 27,000 that look like this. So, you know, if the students kind of have an idea of what is expected of them, that you're going to ask, you know, 2 of these 10, they can do this kind of work. And so the idea being is that the student leaves a class. If you have 4 exams a semester like we do, and they get 10 concept sketch questions they have to study for each exam, they leave your classes with an in-depth understanding of the 40 most important topics in the class. Okay, we're going to do one more little experiment here. I'm going to give you some words. I want you to hold them in your brain, and then I want you to team up with your partner and try to repeat these words to the person in the order. It's only 4:10, come on. Okay. So I'm going to show them, and then they're going to go away. Okay, turn to the person next to you and repeat those words. It's a song. That's good. Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the things that made it easier. Yeah, it helps. It helps if English is your first language. So one is these were short, familiar words. They were the same kind of things. They were all animals, and they were in some kind of logical order. Okay, so that made it easy. That was about 7. I guess I've got some more words here, and you're going to do the same thing. As you try to rehearse them with each other, as you try to spell them out with each other after we're done rehearsing them, look at the person's eyes. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to do it. Did you feel the pain, though, in your brain?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what overrunning your cognitive buffers feels like. It turns out that people think that you can hold about 7 things in your brain at once. That's why phone numbers are 7 numbers, minus the area code. And so we think you can hold about 7 objects in your brain. If they're like that, it's not 7. Might be 5. Or 3, or 2 or something, yeah. And so one of the reasons why I was going to have you look at each other's eyes, but typically takes a little longer than we want, is one of the things that happens when you overrun somebody's cognitive buffers is their pupils dilate. And that gives you a glazed over look. All of us who are instructors are laughing because we see that in our students' eyes. And when you see that look, it means you've just overwhelmed their cognitive buffer, the amount of information they can hold in short-term memory. The other thing that overrunning your cognitive buffers does, it triggers a yawn reflex. And so if you have glassy-eyed students that are yawning, might not be a caffeine thing. It might be that you've just overrun their buffers. So think of the pain that you felt here, and think of the pain that your students feel if you've introduced a whole bunch of new concepts without giving them a chance to put it inside, to internalize it. So anyway, so this whole idea of cognitive load is you have a limited amount of memory you can hold in your brain. And so it limits, you can only keep a few things more. And so if you get more things in than you can hold, your mind usually jettisons the first one in. First one in, first one out. And so we've all had students as instructors come up and say, they have the whole book highlighted. And they say, I highlighted everything and I still failed the test. Because that material was just going through the brain. None of it was getting stopped. There wasn't a chance for the student to reconcile it. And so it means that in lectures, we're not anti-lecture folks. We think lecture's really great in a lot of cases for a lot of good things. But we think you limit it to something like 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and then students have a chance to draw concept sketches or something else in class in order to get that information that's in short-term memory and try to put it inside long-term memory. And likewise, it means that, on field trips, we do very little on field trips. If you sit there and go to the first outcrop and talk for 15 minutes, you can assume that the students remembered the last 5 things you said at that outcrop and none of the first ones, or very few. Whereas if you say a few things, then the students look, or you have them talk to each other on the outcrop, there's a whole bunch of strategies there. And likewise, this is the problem with the traditional textbooks that Richard Mayer was after, is if you're reading, that stuff may not stick. And so we recommend that in any setting, any one of those settings, you just have a little bit of time for students to consolidate their knowledge, to say, here's what I know about cognitive load. Take a second with each other and explain what you think cognitive load is and how you think it influences what we do in classrooms. Do that. Okay, so just a couple things. So notice how easy that was for me to do as an instructor. It wasn't a big deal. What it meant was that I've lost time. I've lost time having you guys observe sea surface temperature patterns. I've lost time having you talk to each other about what you think possible answers are to divergent questions. We've lost time having you take time to consolidate information. And what that means is you can't cover every single thing in lecture that you want to cover. And so, and one more thing I want to talk about with cognitive load. Rich and Mary did another experiment where they gave one group of students this thing with a little paragraph, and then another group of students got a paragraph of an airplane being struck by lightning, and you interview the students. All they remembered that their airplane got struck by lightning. And so these little stories that people like to put in things, turns out that they detract from student learning. And so if there's really important stuff, then you include it. But if it's these little interesting stories that are kind of off to the side, you're probably decreasing student conceptual learning. And so if you take all of this in, what you would say is you want to make sure that you design materials to reduce cognitive load and to make it easier to learn and reconcile these two processing subsystems. And so this would be something it looks like. And so here's an example of caves and kind of how they form. This is the guy who did the game Myst, that did that diagram. Sorry, with a little off conversation, but and this is the guy that was working on Narnia for me. So not for me. He left me to work on Narnia. And so one is you try to integrate text and figures. Two, you try to put in really clear breaks so the students learn one thing at a time. And then the last thing you do is try to have the students make sure that they can assess their own knowledge, that they have time to consolidate it on their own. So, this is one approach to trying to design education materials to get around the problems of this dual coding of information, text, pictures, and to look at how cognitive load works. And I always recommend you start with the learning objectives. You say, here's what I want the students to be able to do. In our case, we wrote a textbook. These are pages out of the textbook. That's going to surprise you, I'm sure. But in this case, we wrote these things first. We said, we want them to be able to do this. And then I say, okay, if they would need to sketch an angular unconformity and describe how it forms, what figures do I need? And then what do I have to say around those figures? And only then did I draw the sketch of the figures. And so it really is, we recommend that you start with the learning objectives and say, what's most important? What do I want my students to do? What are the goals in the class? And then you work back from there. It's not how most people do it, but. And so in our case, we take all these little boxes that show this kind of stuff, and we put them in a big Word file, and we delete the ones we don't want. We hand it out to the students, and we say, here's what you're responsible for, whether we talk about it in class or not. So you've just forced the students to read the textbook in all those items that you didn't talk about in class, which is going to be most of them. And so if you can develop a what to know list, it's kind of like a study guide, except you hand it out before the students read. You say, here's what's important, and I'm going to assess you on these things. And anyway, so that what to know list is the most liberating thing you can do to your teaching, because it will mean you do not have to cover everything in class. You can say, you have to learn this section about the Archean from the textbook, because I'm not going to talk about it. Or whatever. Okay. So I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. And so let's just stop right there. Thanks for coming.